Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Senior B English and our conversation with T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. Now we have already worked with an introductory set of comments and with the first of the 4 quartet poems, Burnt Norton. We now turn to the classic East Coker, published in 1940, 4 years after Burnt Norton. We'll have more to say about this timing, it's important. East Coker, let's get this out of the way right away. A small community in England, okay, where T.S. Eliot's ancestors actually came from, all right? So it's significant that we should point out that T.S. Eliot's ancestors came from this area called East Coker, and when T.S. Eliot died, his ashes were placed in St. Michael's in East Coker. So in other words, in some very interesting ways, the opening lines, literally, in my beginning is my end, will have some resonance, obviously, because his family's beginning is in East Coker and he will return back there. Now, LearnStrong.net Senior B folder, you really do want to have paid attention to several lectures if you're just coming to this lecture for the first time. I mean, if you really want to have a sense of, you know, how to read this stuff closely. For sure, I would say watch my background lecture of introductory comments for all of the 4 quartets, where we kind of summarize everything. We talk through a lot of the topics that we're going to focus on, including, of course, our conversation here. As well, I would say you need to have watched my lecture on Burnt Norton, because I'm going to borrow heavily from that lecture. We're going to make all kinds of references. And I would say make sure that you've watched my lectures on Wasteland, as well as Hollow Men. Journey of Magi will be important as well here. So, and Proof Rock, we're going to make all kinds of observations with Proof Rock. So having said all of that, let's just remind. Our learning theory in 303 is always attempting to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. Not just knowing stuff or memorizing stuff, but actually gaining information that we can use. In our reading and our annotative approach, we will do that through the answering of our 3 guiding questions of our 3 levels of reading. At level 1, what does the text say? Summarizing. At level 2, what does the text mean? At 2A, themes, messages. At 2B, we're looking at the rhetoric, not what T.S. Eliot says, but how he says it. And we'll pay attention to things like symbolism and that repetition. We'll continue to see some of that information here in East Coker as well. Finally, at level 3, we ask, how can I relate to information like this? Like, for example, at 3A, how can I relate this to other stuff? Now, because we've already finished with Burnt Norton, and this is why I love teaching the 4 quartets. Once you understand how to read one of the 4 quartets, we'll say Burnt Norton, when you pick up East Coker, I'm going to challenge you to tell me, do you think that you could do it a little bit better? I'm going to argue, yeah, I think so. And then by the end of our reading, we'll be halfway through 4 quartets at the conclusion of this lecture. I'm hoping that you're able to pick up the other 2, Dry Salvages and Little Gidding, and you'll be able to even more understand how to read. In other words, reading one of the quartets helps you to read the ones to follow. Finally, at level 3B, and most importantly, we'll ask, how can you, me, us, relate to a text like this personally? And I hope, if I do anything, that I'm not just telling you this is great poetry, which I believe it to be, and stuff that you should read, which I also believe you should, simply taking my word for it, but rather I hope that you can find your own reasons, your own motivations to pick up texts like this and to go to work with them. Now, again, our approach will be very much like our Burnt Norton lecture. We're going to have the Al Guinness reading, then we'll come back to annotate on all 3 of our levels, okay? And again, as we said, learning to read Burnt Norton, I think you'll find, will help you to be able to read East Coker, okay? Once you kind of know what the 5 parts of each poem is doing. Let's do some quick, brief background work here, just because prior knowledge always helps us as we get ready for our study. Take some quick notes here before we get into the text itself. Now again, I'm hoping that you read the text and annotate the text on your own, and then come to my observations here after you've done your own annotative work. That's my hope anyway. 1939. T.S. Eliot is actually not sure that he's going to write any more poetry. It's the start of the Second World War. It is difficult to appreciate today what it was like to go through the horrific Great War. They didn't call it the First World War, because you don't call it a First World War until there's a Second World War, right? To go through that horrific war, and everybody's in agreement, we'll never do that again. And then, in 1939, it starts all over again. And now we'll call the First World War the First World War because, hello, we've got a Second World Great War. And it leads to a lot of consternation and doubt about what is going on. And in fact, Eliot's not sure that he's going to write any more poetry. Of course, the war ends in 1945. I mean, think about that. The four quartets, right, will be published in 1943 in New York and in 1944 in London, 1 year before the end of the war, right? The three final poems then of four quartets were all written during World War II. We cannot overstate this, and when we get into East Coker, we're going to see references several times to these wars and the devastations of these wars right away in the opening lines, in fact. East Coker, an area in England, was visited by T.S. Eliot in 1937, and again, as we've said, the St. Michael's Church that he would visit would ultimately be where he would put his ashes, along with some lines from this very East Coker poem. There is an argument to be made that of the four quartets, and there's always been this debate, which one is the most important or the best. When T.S. Eliot was asked, he actually said that one of the parts of this poem, East Coker, was the heart of the matter, and the fact that he left lines to be placed there for his ashes and his burial suggests that maybe for him East Coker is a really important one of the four poems. I don't think that it's fair. It's kind of like asking about Pete Jackson's trilogy of The Lord of the Rings. I don't think it's fair to ask which one's the best movie, because they all go together to form one perfect, I say perfect, okay, nearly perfect whole. And I think the same is true of the four quartets. I mean, we've got four poems which work together, can I say this, symphonically. I think Eliot would agree with that kind of musical language of symphony, all right? T.S. Eliot's ancestors actually left this area of East Coker in 1669 to travel to America to take a pilgrimage. Of course, it will be ironic that later T.S. Eliot, born in St. Louis, as we said in earlier lectures, will take a pilgrimage and will leave America and will come back to this very region, East Coker, and ultimately his ashes are buried there. While he changed his citizenship to the English citizenship in 1927, along with that conversion experience that's so significant to our reading of this poem, he always claimed that he still believed that he was fundamentally an American as well as he was English. And so there's some interesting things going on there, right? Think about that one. In 1669, we're 2 years after Milton's publishing in 1667 of Paradise Lost. So it just gives you kind of a sense of the trajectory when his ancestors left and came to the United States. East Coker, as we've said, published March 1940 on Good Friday, actually Good Friday, and that'll be significant for later in the poem. The idea of the four quartets as a unit really took off after T.S. Eliot wrote East Coker. What he did is he went back and he looked at Burnt Norton, and he wondered if he could go ahead and do something similar with the five parts in a new poem that he ended up calling East Coker. Again, a poem of place. If the first place is Burnt Norton, that mansion that has that really cool garden there, East Coker is this kind of area. It's very bucolic, it's very beautiful. It's kind of out in the world of nature, and we're going to see all of that right away. Well, let's play the game with a couple of different ways to talk about overview here, right? It is a poem of late summer, it's a poem of earth, and it's definitely a poem of faith, so we want to write that one down. The five sections, again, will play the same game as we did in Burnt Norton, as we'll play in all the other two remaining as well. Part 1, some consideration of time. Part 2, some consideration of experience. Part 3, the quest for purgation, right, of some kind. Part 4, that's that lyrical prayer that's usually very short. And Part 5, the search for some sense of wholeness. Let's say it another way. Section 1 of East Coker, time and the eternal moment. Section 2, disorder in nature, right? Opposite to Section 2 of Burnt Norton. The quest to try to understand that rational knowledge, scientific knowledge, is not enough to explain reality, and that science and rationality are not enough to provide us with true progress, because true progress is not the progress of the way we normally define progress. Section 3, the flows and the flaws and the imprecision of politicians, administrators of all kinds that try and come to some kind of knowledge, true knowledge. The only real wisdom is the wisdom of humility, we will hear. Part 4, we'll talk about the paradoxes involved in the Eucharist and Good Friday and the Mass, and that will be what T.S. Eliot called the heart of the matter, as we'll talk about it. Finally, Part 5, the hope of old age to explore. Now, there's another way to take a look at this, and I think it's significant that we do it. I want to suggest for your notes that T.S. Eliot had in the back of his mind the 3rd chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. What T.S. Eliot said from the Bible. T.S. Eliot said it's the most beautiful poetry in all of the Bible, which is saying something. And for a great poet to say that makes us maybe want to return to this writing of Ecclesiastes attributed to the great Solomon, one of the wisest men who ever lived, so they say. And he had this to say in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. I'm reading from the King James Version of the Bible. To every thing there is a season, a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, a time to die. A time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to cast away. A time to rend, and a time to sow. A time to keep silence, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time of war, and a time of peace. Now, I think that these words, you're going to hear these resonances all the way through East Coker. Okay? And so that's another way for us to take a look at it. Let's finish with one last one from Paul Kramer's Redeeming Time. He says it this way, and I'm going to follow much of what he says because I think it makes so much sense to do so. For East Coker section 1, he says, we're working with another landscape meditation. The open field is what he'll call it. Section 2, a sudden or a temporal illumination, the wisdom of humility. We will hear about it. Section 3, spiritual practices, namely, be still. Section 4, this will be our brief lyrical interlude, the wounded surgeon, as is often referred to. Okay? Remember again that this was published on Good Friday of 1940 in the New English Weekly, it was called. And then finally, Section 5, a middle way vision, attempting to somehow embrace the coexistence of wisdom and practice, union and communion will be the attribution that we will give for Part 5. Okay, let's turn now to East Coker, Part 1. These are lines 1 through 51, or if you're keeping count and you're just continuing your numbering after Bert Norton, it's lines 179 to 229, okay? Now again, the challenge is here. Will sound almost like the methodology of Bert Norton, to conquer monkey mind, distracted from distractions by distractions, you'll remember was the line from Bert Norton, right? To try to conquer monkey mind and to look specifically at what we're trying to understand here through the reading. So as we, for example, begin our reading of this poem, I do challenge you, see if you can really focus instead of looking up, looking around, how much longer is this going to take? Really see if you can begin to conquer monkey mind as we go forward. Here we go, the first section of East Coker.
In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall, crumble and extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field or a factory or a bypass. Old stone to new buildings, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to the earth, which is already flesh, fur, and feces, bone of man and beast, cornstalk and leaf. Houses live and die. There is a time for building, and a time for living and for generation, and a time for the wind to break the loosened pane, and to shake the wainscot where the field mouse trots, and to shake the tattered arras woven with a silent motto. In my beginning is my end. Now the light falls across the open field, leaving the deep lane shuttered with branches, dark in the afternoon, where you lean against a bank while a van passes, and the deep lane insists on the direction into the village, in the electric heat, hypnotized. In a warm haze, the sultry light is absorbed, not refracted, by grey stone. The dahlias sleep in the empty silence. Wait for the early owl. In that open field, if you do not come too close, if you do not come too close, on a summer midnight you can hear the music of the weak pipe and the little drum, and see them dancing around the bonfire, the association of man and woman in dancing, signifying matrimony, a dignified and commodious sacrament, two and two, necessary conjunction, holding each other by the hand or the arm, which betokeneth concord. Round and round the fire, leaping through the flames, or joined in circles, rustically solemn or in rustic laughter, lifting heavy feet in clumsy shoes, earth feet, loam feet, lifted in country mirth, mirth of those long since under earth, nourishing the corn, keeping time, keeping the rhythm in their dancing, as in their living in the living seasons, the time of the seasons and the constellations, the time of milking and the time of harvest, the time of the coupling of man and woman and that of beasts, feet rising and falling, eating and drinking, dung and death. Dawn points, and another day prepares for heat and silence. Out at sea the dawn wind wrinkles and slides. I am here or there or elsewhere, in my beginning.
All right, let's turn now to East Coker, Section 1, Movement 1. And this will not shock us in some ways. We're back to the theme of time right away. We are in an English landscape like in Burnt Norton. And the opening lines here are, "In my beginning is my end." Now, as we already pointed out, the ironies of this abound. T.S. Eliot's ashes are, in fact, in East Coker, in St. Michael, in that church, in that little cathedral there. By the way, you can Google image that, and I hope that you do, so that you can kind of get a sense of it. So, in other words, there's kind of a return here. By the way, let's just point out, the lines, "In my beginning is my end," as well, are a reversal of what Mary, Queen of Scots, on her martyrdom said. "In my end is my beginning," is what she said right before she got jacked. And so notice we're playing a reversal already going on there, right? Notice to continue then, in succession. Let's work now lines 1 through 13 quickly. In succession, the idea, of course, of the circle of life, houses rise and fall. Now, of course, the irony here is, again, the house of Eliot began in East Coker and in many ways ends in East Coker. Houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, and here immediately we recognize that we are talking about the destruction of war, of course, the Second World War about to begin, right? Or in their place is an open field or a factory or a bypass. In other words, you've got the fields that we're going to see here in a little bit, and the marriage ceremony. Old stone to new building. Of course, we're going to hear all about the important symbol of stones. Go back, for example, to the Ecclesiastes 3, verse 5, actual passage, in fact, actually said, "A time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones together," right? Old timbers to new fires. Makes us think about Burnt Norton. That, of course, was that mansion of the first quartet. It burned down, had to be rebuilt and all of that. Old fires to ashes. Ashes, of course, are significant. We said that T.S. Eliot's literal ashes are there in East Coker, but ashes and ashes to the earth are going to play an important role in this East Coker poem as well. To the earth, which is already flesh, fur, and feces. We think about T.S. Eliot sailing to Byzantium, fish, flesh, or fowl come in all summer long, whatever is begotten, born, and dies. T.S. Eliot, very influenced by the poetry of his pal Yeats. And here we see it, that notion of the great circle of life. Some of you, of course, are ready to start singing your Lion King song and all of that, right? Bone of man and beast, cornstalk and leaf. Houses live and die. This notion that, again, you can talk about the house being a physical structure, and you can talk about house being like a family. Later it will be home, is where one starts from at the end of this poem. So we're going to start with houses and end with homes, right? There is a time for building, a time for living, for generation, a time for wind to break the loosened pane. And again, this notion of there's a time, there's a time. By the way, you can go through and count the number of times the word time gets used, and we're building already off of what we were doing in Bert Norton, aren't we? A time to shake the wainscot, where the field mouse trots. We think about Burns's to a mouse, the best laid plans of mice and men soon off to go awry. You can watch my lecture on Learn Strong in the Senior B folder for that one as well. To shake the tattered air is woven with a silent motto. So in other words, here we're playing games, right? The idea as well is that everything decays and then it returns, right? Think about Whitman's Song of Myself, passage 6, when the child brings him the grass and asks what it is, and he says, of course, that the grass is the handkerchief of the Lord, a designated remembrancer. In the end, of course, grass is the great symbol of death, and we're playing this very similar kind of game over again, right? Lines 14 through 23 now will have the echoes coming back. In my beginning is my end. So a repeat of the very first line. And then the light falls across an open field. We're back to the open field of line 4. Leaving the deep lane shuttered with branches, dark in the afternoon, where you lean against the bank. Now, I mean, this notion of you leaning, of course, we know this from our Whitman study, don't we? The opening stanza of Song of Myself, passage 1, is that he says, I lean on a piece of summer grass. This idea as well of you lean, this idea is almost like he invites the reader into. It's a very intimate kind of approach. It's a very Whitman-esque kind of approach. You lean against the bank while a van passes in the deep lane, insists on the direction into the village, and now we're going to have a dichotomy already being created. We're going to have the town, which